Evan Carter's life was an enigma. Few people knew of his wealth, and even fewer understood the lengths he'd go to keep it concealed. With a net worth that could rival entire corporations, Evan chose a life far from luxury. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, and those who crossed paths with him mistook his plain clothes and unassuming nature for ordinariness. This was precisely what he wanted. Jack, his only son, had grown up unaware of the true extent of their wealth until he was nearly an adult. And even then, Evan had given him a stark choice: live humbly and understand the value of trust, or inherit nothing. Jack had chosen wisely, but he sometimes wondered about his father's motives. There was an edge to Evan's lessons that always felt like more than just fatherly advice, as if he were preparing Jack for a future in which he would need every ounce of discretion and wisdom. Jack met Sophie Richardson during his second year of college. She was refreshingly genuine, with a wit that kept him on his toes. But Sophie came with her own set of complications. Her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Richardson were respected in society, known for their well-connected circle and relentless pursuit of status. Jack kept his financial background hidden from Sophie, an exercise in humility as his father had instructed. But he wondered if Sophie's parents would ever truly accept someone they viewed as poor. One evening, Sophie invited Jack to dinner with her parents. Jack dreaded the evening, knowing he'd face more than polite introductions. The Richardsons' reputation preceded them, and he'd heard enough from Sophie to know that they were the kind who measured a man by his bank account. He'd shared his anxieties with his father, half expecting Evan to allow him a reprieve from their pact of secrecy. Instead, Evan's response was oddly encouraging. "Let them see what they wish to see," he had said, a mysterious gleam in his eye. "Let them judge you, Jack. You might find they're not as immune to deception as they think." Confused but intrigued, Jack went along with his father's plan. The Richardson house was a sprawling estate, lavishly decorated with high-end furniture, gold-framed mirrors, and an intimidatingly large dining room. Jack arrived in a plain button-down shirt and well-worn jeans, feeling like an outsider in this palace of wealth and refinement. The Richardsons greeted him with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Mr. Richardson, a tall man with sharp features and an expensive watch gleaming on his wrist, studied Jack with the look of someone assessing an investment. "So, Jack, what are your plans after graduation?" he asked, his tone more interrogative than curious. Jack, who had been coached by his father to downplay his ambitions, gave a vague answer about finding his path and making an honest living. He watched as Mr. Richardson's mouth twitched, an almost imperceptible sneer creeping in. Mrs. Richardson, whose carefully tailored suit and impeccable pearls made her look like a matriarch from an old money dynasty, exchanged a glance with her husband. They spent the evening subtly picking Jack apart, veiling their disdain in pleasant conversation. Mrs. Richardson praised Sophie's friend, who had married a wealthy banker, emphasizing that he was so well established, with a beautiful home and everything one could want for a family. Jack remained polite, but each remark stung. Beneath her pleasant smile, Mrs. Richardson's message was clear. He wasn't good enough. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sophie excused herself to take a call. As soon as she was out of earshot, Mrs. Richardson's demeanor changed. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a predatory glint. "Jack," she began softly, "I want you to understand something. We have high hopes for Sophie. She's our only daughter, and we want the best for her. Stability, security, a certain lifestyle." Jack met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I understand, Mrs. Richardson. I care about Sophie very much." "I'm sure you do," she replied, her tone smooth yet laced with a hint of menace. "But love doesn't pay the bills, does it?" Mr. Richardson joined in, his voice low and unyielding. "We built our lives from the ground up, Jack. We expect any man who wants to join this family to have ambition, drive, a real future. What do you have to offer, Sophie?" Jack held his breath, refusing to let his temper flare. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Let them see what they wish to see." Calmly, Jack replied, "I'm working hard to make something of myself, sir." "I don't believe wealth defines a person." Mr. Richardson scoffed, leaning back with a disdainful chuckle. "Only the poor say that." Just then, Sophie re-entered the room, oblivious to the tension that had filled the air in her absence. She beamed at Jack, taking his hand and pulling him close. The Richardsons' faces softened in her presence, but Jack could still feel the weight of their unspoken judgment. As they left the house, Sophie sighed contentedly, her arm around Jack's. "I think my parents really liked you." Jack forced a smile, saying nothing about the gauntlet he'd just endured. When he got home, Evan was waiting, his expression thoughtful. Jack recounted the evening, every slight and insult, every veiled threat. Evan listened in silence, but a faint smile played at his lips. There was something almost conspiratorial in his gaze as he poured them each a glass of whiskey. "Well, it seems they're just as I remembered," Evan muttered, almost to himself. Jack frowned. "Wait, what do you mean, remembered?" Evan didn't answer right away. He took a long sip, then finally looked his son in the eye. "Let's just say the Richardsons have been climbing their way up for years. They had to make certain sacrifices along the way, ethical ones, moral ones. It would be a shame if they were reminded of them at an inconvenient time." Jack's eyes widened, piecing together his father's cryptic words. "You know something about them, don't you?" Evan's smile was chilling. "I know enough, Jack. Enough to turn their carefully crafted world upside down." For the first time, Jack saw a side of his father he'd never known, a master strategist, playing a long game. The Richardsons thought they were evaluating him, that they were the ones holding the cards. Little did they know, they were unwitting pieces in a much larger scheme. Evan and Jack arrived at the Richardson estate in the fading light of dusk, their shadows stretching across the grand entrance. Dressed in second-hand jackets and jeans, they looked wildly out of place against the towering columns and manicured hedges of the Richardson mansion. Jack swallowed his nerves as the door opened to reveal Mrs. Richardson, smiling politely, though her eyes betrayed a glint of distaste as she took in their attire. "Jack, Mr. Carter," she greeted, her voice as smooth as silk, yet laced with something cold. "We're so delighted you could join us." Evan, unfazed, extended a hand and introduced himself with the easy calm of a man with nothing to prove. Mrs. Richardson accepted his handshake, her grip cold and quick. She led them into the home, her heels clicking on the marble floors, the soft hum of classical music filling the air. The dining room was a shrine to opulence. A crystal chandelier cast a golden glow over a sprawling table set with fine china and glittering silverware. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, depicting scenes of historic battles and triumphs, a display of the family's heritage. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach, but he kept his expression steady. Mr. Richardson entered, shaking Jack's hand with an overly firm grip before turning to Evan. His eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Jack's father, sizing him up with a practiced eye. "So, Evan," Mr. Richardson said, his tone thick with forced civility, "Jack tells us you've worked in finance." Evan nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Yes, here and there." "Here and there?" Mr. Richardson's brow furrowed, his interest piqued, yet his words carried a tinge of mockery. "I must say, I expected something a little more ambitious for a man with a son interested in our Sophie." Evan's smile remained fixed. "Ambition is subjective, don't you think?" The comment seemed to throw Mr. Richardson off balance, though he quickly recovered. "Perhaps, but a man ought to have something to show for his ambition, especially if he's hoping to join our family." His gaze lingered on Jack, a challenge veiled in polite words. As they took their seats, Mrs. Richardson began asking questions, her voice lilting but her words sharp. "So, Jack, I hear you're studying liberal arts? How quaint." Jack offered a tense smile. "I'm planning to pursue a career in writing." Mrs. Richardson's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of disapproval that didn't go unnoticed. "Writing? That's quite brave. But I suppose Sophie has always had a soft spot for artists and dreamers." Her gaze shifted briefly to Evan, who sat calmly, observing every word and gesture, his expression unreadable. The evening progressed, each course served with delicate precision by an attentive staff. The Richardsons continued to probe, their questions polite on the surface, but laced with judgments that sliced through the air. Evan remained unbothered, answering in clipped, enigmatic phrases, often with just enough ambiguity to let their assumptions run wild. Jack could feel the tension building, a quiet storm gathering beneath the civility. It wasn't until dessert that Mr. Richardson, emboldened by wine, finally dropped his mask. "Tell me, Evan," he began, leaning forward with a smug smile, "how does one live so modestly when one has a son to provide for?" Surely you'd want Jack to aspire to something more substantial? Evan tilted his head, his eyes glinting with an amused darkness. Substance, Mr. Richardson, isn't always measured by wealth. Sometimes it's in what you don't reveal that true power lies. The room grew silent, a charged energy hanging in the air. Mrs. Richardson's polite smile faltered, a trace of unease flickering in her gaze as she exchanged a look with her husband. But Mr. Richardson pressed on, his voice dripping with condescension. Power, you say? I'd argue that power lies in influence, connections, assets, respect. He paused, his tone sharpening. I hope, for your sake, that you haven't led Jack to believe otherwise. Evan chuckled, an unsettling sound that sent a chill through the room. Oh, he understands influence well, I assure you. But influence doesn't always come from wealth or connections. Sometimes it's the quiet influence. Observing, learning, waiting. Mrs. Richardson's fork clattered against her plate. She quickly composed herself, but her eyes betrayed a hint of fear, as if she sensed the presence of a force she didn't fully understand. Mr. Richardson's confidence waned slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Waiting for what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evan didn't answer directly. Instead, he fixed Mr. Richardson with a piercing gaze. Sometimes, influence is simply knowing what strings to pull, and when. The silence that followed was suffocating, each member of the Richardson family suddenly feeling as though they were standing on shaky ground. Evan leaned back, crossing his arms, his calm smile as unmovable as granite. As they left, Mrs. Richardson attempted to salvage her poise, offering Evan a tight-lipped smile and a quick farewell. Mr. Richardson, however, seemed unsettled, his gaze following them out with a mixture of confusion and fear. As they walked away from the house, Jack glanced back, catching a glimpse of the Richardsons standing stiffly at the doorway, watching them with expressions that had shifted from superiority to something closer to dread. Jack's curiosity burned, but he kept silent, not daring to break the spell his father had cast. It wasn't until they were far from the estate, under the cover of night, that Evan turned to his son, a cryptic smile on his lips. Patience, Jack. This is only the beginning. In the days following their tense dinner with the Richardsons, Jack felt the distance growing between him and Sophie's parents. Their disapproval hung over every interaction like an invisible cloud, casting a chill over moments that should have been joyful. Though Sophie tried to ignore it, her mother's icy glances and her father's critical remarks gnawed at her, and she confided her frustrations to Jack. What did I expect? Sophie sighed one afternoon, shaking her head as they walked through the campus garden. My parents think they know what's best for me. They don't see how happy I am with you, Jack. They only see what they want to see. Jack kissed her forehead, pulling her close. He could feel her frustration, her struggle between loyalty to her family and her love for him. But he also knew this struggle was about to intensify. The following weekend, Sophie invited Jack and Evan to a small family gathering at her parents' house. This time, Jack sensed that something more was at stake. Her father had called it a friendly get-together, but Jack had a feeling there was nothing friendly about it. When he shared his concerns with Evan, his father's eyes glinted with a strange satisfaction. This will be interesting, Evan remarked, his tone cryptic. The night of the gathering, Jack arrived to find the Richardsons' home bustling with activity. Several of Mr. Richardson's colleagues were there, along with a few extended family members and friends of Sophie's parents, each one more polished and affluent than the last. Jack felt their eyes on him as he walked in, sensing the curiosity and skepticism in their gazes. But he steeled himself, determined not to give the Richardsons the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Mrs. Richardson approached him first, her smile polite but cool. Jack, so glad you could make it, she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled disdain. We thought it would be nice for you to meet some of the people in Sophie's life, those who matter. Jack felt his jaw tighten, but he forced a smile, greeting her with as much grace as he could muster. The gathering was nothing short of a gauntlet. One by one, Sophie's father's colleagues and friends made subtle jabs at his modest attire, his ambitions, and his simple lifestyle. Jack endured their remarks in silence, responding with polite nods and brief replies, refusing to rise to their bait. Halfway through the evening, Mr. Richardson approached Jack with a smug smile, his arm around one of his wealthy business associates. Jack, I wanted you to meet Mr. Carson here. He's been very successful in the tech world, a man of real ambition. The emphasis on real wasn't lost on Jack. Mr. Carson extended his hand, his gaze appraising. Jack, is it? Tell me, what field do you work in? I'm still studying, actually, Jack replied, keeping his tone level. I'm planning to pursue writing. Mr. Carson's smile grew strained, a hint of condescension flickering in his eyes. Writing? Not much of a career in that, is there? Jack's face flushed, but he kept his voice steady. I believe there's value in pursuing one's passion, regardless of its financial reward. Oh, that's sweet, Mrs. Richardson interjected, her voice dripping with false admiration. I'm sure you'll be very fulfilled. Evan had been observing the entire exchange from across the room, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. He knew this was precisely the reaction the Richardsons and their friends would have. But as the evening wore on, Evan noticed a pattern. The Richardsons were not simply trying to embarrass Jack, they were testing him, prodding for weakness, looking for signs of inferiority. Evan leaned toward Jack as they passed each other in the crowded room, his voice low and filled with a strange calm. They want to see if you'll break, Jack. Don't give them the satisfaction. Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. But his patience was tested to the limit when, later that evening, Mr. Richardson presented Sophie with an extravagant gift, a set of keys to a brand new luxury car. We wanted our daughter to travel in style, he announced, his gaze flickering toward Jack. We want her to have the life she deserves, after all. The crowd murmured in admiration, Sophie looking bewildered as her parents beamed with pride. Jack felt a pang of anger rise within him. The message was clear. This was a life Sophie could never have with a man like him. But just then, Evan stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The room fell silent as he addressed Mr. Richardson, his voice cool and deliberate. Generous gift, Evan remarked, tilting his head slightly. But gifts come in many forms, don't they? Mr. Richardson's brow furrowed, his gaze shifting to Evan with a hint of suspicion. Meaning? Evan's smile was razor-sharp. Not all gifts come with a price tag. Some are more enduring. Perhaps one day, Jack and Sophie will have something more lasting than a car. Mrs. Richardson's lips tightened, her smile now forced. Well, we believe in providing for our daughter's future, Mr. Carter. Evan's eyes glinted with quiet intensity. So do I, Mrs. Richardson. And I assure you, I've been planning for it for a long time. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet battle waged with words and veiled meanings. For the first time, Jack saw his father as more than just an observer. He was a formidable opponent, one who seemed to be playing a game far beyond the Richardsons' understanding. As the evening drew to a close, Jack and Evan took their leave. Outside, under the cover of darkness, Evan looked at his son, his face unreadable. Consider this a test, Jack, he said, voice barely above a whisper. And remember, the people who value wealth above character often have the most to lose. Jack didn't fully understand his father's words, but he could sense a shift, an unspoken promise in Evan's gaze. Whatever game the Richardsons were playing, his father seemed more than ready to match them. The invitation to the engagement celebration arrived in the mail a week later, thick and heavy in its embossed envelope, the Richardson family crest emblazoned in gold. Jack and Evan were invited, though the invitation seemed more like a summons. Sophie was ecstatic, her excitement evident as she hugged Jack and talked about the upcoming event. When the day arrived, Jack dressed in his most modest suit, and Evan followed suit. His attire still carefully curated to appear simple, almost frugal. They arrived at the Richardson estate by taxi, their plainness standing in sharp contrast to the sleek luxury cars that lined the driveway. Jack felt the familiar surge of nerves, but Evan's calm, steady gaze anchored him. Inside, the mansion was transformed. The chandeliers cast warm light over polished marble, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Guests milled about in designer attire, each one more extravagantly dressed than the last. Mr. Richardson was stationed by the grand staircase, laughing loudly with his friends as he regaled them with stories of his successes. Mrs. Richardson spotted Jack and Evan, her lips curving into a tight smile as she approached them. Her gaze swept over their outfits with a barely concealed smirk. Evan, Jack, how quaint of you to join us, she said, her voice dripping with polite condescension. Evan inclined his head, his expression impenetrable. Thank you for having us, Mrs. Richardson. Quite a remarkable gathering. Mrs. Richardson's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a double meaning in his words. She glanced at Jack, her tone turning even cooler. We're so pleased that Sophie has found someone who grounds her. She's always had a habit of romanticizing things. Some people would call it loyalty, Evan replied smoothly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Before Mrs. Richardson could respond, the attention shifted to Mr. Richardson, who clinked his glass and cleared his throat. He gathered the guests in a circle, and with a flourish, he handed Sophie a small, velvet-lined box. Sophie's face lit up as she opened it to reveal a delicate, sparkling bracelet encrusted with diamonds. For my daughter, Mr. Richardson announced, his voice brimming with pride, a token of our family's love and our hopes for her bright future. His eyes drifted pointedly to Jack, and for her happiness, of course. Jack clenched his fists, feeling the silent jab, but he remained silent, his expression calm. Sophie hugged her father, her gratitude genuine, but Jack could feel the sting of Mr. Richardson's message. Jack would never be able to offer her something so luxurious. The evening wore on, with Jack and Evan enduring the Richardsons' friends' thinly veiled jabs. Finally, when dessert was served, Evan quietly slipped away, returning moments later with a single white envelope in his hand. He walked up to Sophie and placed the envelope in her hands, his eyes holding hers. The room fell silent, the guests pausing to watch the strange, unassuming gesture. What's this? Sophie asked, looking puzzled. Evan smiled. A small gift. Open it, please. As Sophie tore open the envelope, a hush spread through the room. Out of it slipped a single piece of paper. Her eyes widened as she read the text, her mouth opening in surprise. It's a deed? Sophie stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. To a townhouse in the city? The murmurs rippled through the crowd as heads turned, eyes widening with shock. Mrs. Richardson's face went pale, and Mr. Richardson's smug expression froze in place. A modest wedding gift for my son and his fiancée, Evan said softly, his tone unassuming. Something they can grow into. Mr. Richardson recovered quickly, and though there was an edge of panic in his laugh. Well, Evan, I wasn't aware. Are you sure you can manage something of that magnitude? His tone held a faint hint of a sneer, as though still hoping to diminish Evan's gesture. Evan's eyes darkened slightly, a glimmer of something dangerous beneath his calm. I believe I can manage. Mrs. Richardson, visibly rattled, forced a brittle smile. It's very generous of you, she managed, her words sounding almost choked. She looked between Evan and Mr. Richardson, as if searching for answers she couldn't grasp. Evan's smile held, but there was a glint in his gaze that was as sharp as a blade. Generosity is an investment in the right people, Mrs. Richardson. Wouldn't you agree? The Richardsons' carefully curated facade was cracking, the weight of Evan's gift pulling at the seams of their composure. The guests watched with fascination, sensing a shift in power that they couldn't quite understand. Evan took a step back, his eyes never leaving Mr. Richardson's. The true measure of wealth, he murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, isn't in what you possess, but in what you can give without losing yourself. The silence that followed was thick, laden with the realization that Evan Carter was not the man the Richardsons had thought. He had played his part, let them judge him, even let them scorn him. And now, with one simple gesture, he had shattered their illusions, revealing a power that went far beyond their understanding. Jack watched his father with awe, feeling the weight of the lesson Evan had imparted. This wasn't about wealth or social status. This was about knowing who held the cards and when to play them. As the evening wound down, the Richardsons' smiles became strained, their polished image tarnished by the knowledge that they had misjudged Evan Carter and that their own ambitions and pretenses had been laid bare. The aftermath of the engagement party lingered like an unspoken storm. The Richardsons were humiliated, their carefully constructed facade of superiority shattered by Evan's understated yet monumental gift. For days, Sophie's parents avoided speaking about the townhouse deed, but the tension in the Richardson home grew thick with resentment and wounded pride. Sophie, sensing the unspoken hostility, reached out to Jack, apologizing for her parents' behavior and assuring him of her love. She'd been raised to believe in the sanctity of family approval, but her parents' disdain for Jack was beginning to chip away at her loyalty to them. Meanwhile, Mr. Richardson simmered in private, nursing a grudge that festered with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling of being bested by Evan Carter. In his mind, Evan's modest gift was nothing short of a declaration of war, a challenge to the very foundation of his own influence and standing. One evening, unable to bear the sting of his bruised pride, Mr. Richardson summoned a close friend, an influential attorney named Robert Shaw. Shaw was known for his ruthlessness, the kind of man who specialized in wielding power from the shadows. Over glasses of expensive scotch, Mr. Richardson laid out his frustrations, his bitterness spilling over as he recounted Evan's humiliating display. What kind of man keeps that kind of wealth hidden? Mr. Richardson spat, his voice laced with venom. He walks in here looking like a nobody, and then he drops a townhouse on my daughter as if it's nothing. It's a calculated move, Robert. He's mocking me. Shaw listened, his sharp eyes glinting with a predatory interest. It's possible Carter has something he's hiding. People with that kind of money don't stay in the shadows without reason. Perhaps it's time we did some digging. Mr. Richardson's gaze darkened. Yes, I want to know everything. His past, his business, his connections, every secret he's hiding. And so began the quiet, methodical investigation into Evan Carter's life. Shaw pulled strings, tapping into his network of private investigators and leveraging contacts in finance and law enforcement. Slowly, they began piecing together fragments of Evan's past, though the man was surprisingly elusive. It was as if Evan Carter had spent his life meticulously burying every trail, every hint of his true wealth. Meanwhile, Jack sensed a shift in Sophie's parents' behavior. They no longer openly criticized him. Instead, they adopted a strange, watchful silence. Mrs. Richardson seemed colder, her smile more forced, while Mr. Richardson's gaze held a simmering resentment that was barely concealed. Jack mentioned it to his father one evening, but Evan only chuckled, as though he'd been expecting it. Let them dig, Jack, Evan said, his tone laced with a knowing amusement. They'll find only what I allow them to find. Jack was baffled, but chose to trust his father, feeling a strange thrill at the game that seemed to be unfolding. As days turned into weeks, Shaw's investigation hit roadblocks, documents that led nowhere, connections that vanished into thin air. The frustration gnawed at Mr. Richardson, who was unwilling to let this challenge go unanswered. Finally, after exhausting every lead, Shaw found one small thread, a charity organization, listed under Evan's name, that funded a series of scholarships and projects across the country. On the surface, it was a noble endeavor, but something about it piqued Shaw's interest. Digging deeper, he discovered that Evan had been quietly funneling significant amounts of money into this organization for years. But the charity's finances were curiously clean, too clean, almost as if they were meant to divert attention from something else. Shaw presented his findings to Mr. Richardson, who listened with a cold, triumphant gleam in his eyes. So Carter's hiding behind a charity? He sneered. We'll see how noble he looks when we bring this to light. Mr. Richardson wasted no time. He began planting rumors within his social circle, suggesting that Evan's charity was a front for questionable dealings, implying that the money might not be as clean as it appeared. The whispers spread, poisoning the perception of Evan's reputation among those who valued him most. Jack began to notice the changes in how people looked at him and his father, the quiet skepticism in their eyes, the hints of judgment. He confronted his father, who simply shook his head, smiling with the calm of a man who had seen this coming. Remember, Jack, Evan said, his gaze steady. People believe what they're told when it suits them, but the truth has a way of finding its own voice. The following week, Evan arranged for a small gathering, inviting a select group of influential friends and associates. The Richardsons were noticeably absent, but Shaw was present, mingling quietly among the guests, his sharp gaze never leaving Evan. When Evan took the floor to make a speech, the room fell silent. He began by thanking everyone for their support over the years, expressing his gratitude for the friendships and trust that had grown in his life. Then, with a glint in his eye, he spoke of his charity, revealing stories of the lives it had touched, the scholarships that had pulled people from poverty, the projects that had lifted entire communities. Everything we build, we leave behind as a legacy, he concluded, his gaze landing on Shaw. We must choose carefully what kind of legacy we wish to leave. As he spoke, the crowd began to murmur in admiration. the room filling with a renewed respect for Evan's work. Shaw watched, his face pale, realizing too late that Evan had outmaneuvered him, spinning the charity into a beacon of integrity and generosity. That night, as Jack and Evan left the event, Jack looked at his father with newfound awe. "You knew they'd try to ruin you." Evan's smile was sharp. "I counted on it." He glanced over his shoulder, a shadow of something dark flickering in his gaze. And now, it's their turn to face the whispers. The Richardsons, once the instigators of gossip, soon found themselves its targets. Their sudden interest in Evan's finances became the subject of scrutiny, their reputation tainted by their own bitterness. And as Jack held Sophie's hand in the weeks that followed, he felt the final piece of his father's lesson fall into place. An unspoken reminder that true power lay not in wealth, but in knowing how to wield it. The summer sun cast a golden glow over the gathered guests as Jack and Sophie's wedding day dawned, every detail meticulously planned, yet laced with an undercurrent of tension. The Richardson estate, once the venue of choice, was notably absent from the plans. Instead, Evan had arranged for the ceremony to be held on a secluded estate just outside the city, a place surrounded by lush gardens, sprawling oak trees, and the quiet charm of nature. A marked contrast to the opulent grandeur the Richardsons had once envisioned. As the guests arrived, the murmur of admiration and curiosity rippled through the crowd. Many were family friends and associates of Evan's who knew his reputation, but had never witnessed the full extent of his influence. Jack sensed a quiet awe in their gazes, and as he stood waiting for the ceremony to begin, he couldn't help but notice the subtle power shift in the air. Evan, dressed in a classic black suit, stood off to the side, a composed smile on his face as he surveyed the scene. Then, just before the ceremony, Mr. and Mrs. Richardson arrived, their expressions tense, yet determined to put on a gracious front. Mrs. Richardson wore an elegant but understated gown, a departure from her usual flamboyance. Her gaze was sharp as she scanned the unfamiliar setting, clearly unsettled by the lack of control over the event. Mr. Richardson's jaw was set, his eyes flickering with barely concealed resentment as he approached Evan. "Quite the setup," he remarked, his tone forced, betraying the sting of his own bruised pride. "A little understated, don't you think?" Evan's smile didn't falter. Understated has a charm of its own. Sometimes it's best to keep things genuine. The words hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meaning, and for the first time, Mr. Richardson looked away, his confidence waning under Evan's calm, piercing gaze. The ceremony itself was beautiful, intimate, every detail perfectly aligned with Jack and Sophie's vision of a meaningful celebration. Vows were exchanged beneath a canopy of flowers, their words filled with promises of love, support, and loyalty. The crowd was entranced, and even Mrs. Richardson found herself dabbing at her eyes, moved despite herself. After the vows, the reception began, guests mingling under the open sky as laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Yet a subtle tension lingered, a shared awareness of the quiet rivalry simmering beneath the surface. Mr. Richardson's gaze frequently shifted toward Evan, his expression tightening each time he noted the ease with which Evan navigated the crowd, drawing admiration and respect from all those around him. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first dance commenced, Evan approached Mr. Richardson with a glass in hand. He handed it to him, raising his own in a quiet toast. "To family," Evan said, his voice soft but resonant. Mr. Richardson hesitated, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, but he raised his glass nonetheless. They drank in silence, and for a brief moment it seemed they might reach an unspoken truce. But then Evan leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know, William, the thing about power is that it's far more potent when used sparingly." Mr. Richardson's face darkened, his grip tightening on his glass. "What exactly are you implying?" Evan's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Only that true power isn't in flaunting wealth or control. It's in knowing when to step back and when to strike." The color drained from Mr. Richardson's face as Evan's words sank in. In that instant, he understood that Evan hadn't just played him at his own game. He'd orchestrated every move with meticulous precision, letting the Richardsons dig their own graves while he watched from the shadows. The evening continued, but a visible shift had occurred. Mr. Richardson's shoulders slumped, his confidence fractured as he retreated into the background, his presence now a ghostly shadow amidst the revelry. "Mrs. Richardson," Sensing the change in her husband, cast worried glances his way, but he offered no explanation. As Jack and Sophie danced, laughter lighting up their faces, Evan stood watching. His expression softened, satisfied. His son had found love on his own terms, unshaken by the distractions of wealth and power. And as for the Richardsons, they were left to reckon with the empty remnants of their pride and ambition. Toward the end of the night, as the guests began to filter out, Mr. Richardson approached Evan one last time, his face drawn, his voice low and tinged with bitterness. "You played us all along," he muttered, his tone defeated. Evan's gaze held his, unwavering. "I simply let you show who you really are. It's a powerful lesson in humility, wouldn't you say?" Mr. Richardson clenched his jaw, then turned and walked away, his once formidable presence diminished to little more than a broken whisper in the wind. The night wound down, the last guests trickling out as the stars emerged above. Jack found Evan standing alone, a faint smile on his face as he watched the night sky. Jack stepped up beside him, his own gaze following his father's. "Thank you," Jack murmured, emotion thick in his voice. Evan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his smile softening. "I only wanted you to see, Jack, that the greatest strength lies in restraint, and that true power isn't something you wear. It's something you carry within." As they left the venue together, Jack felt a newfound respect for his father, a quiet, unspoken bond that transcended wealth and pride. And as the Richardsons' influence faded into memory, Jack and Sophie's future began with the kind of legacy only Evan could have imparted. A legacy built on wisdom, love, and the quiet strength of a man who knew when to hold his cards and when to play them.